So we start with a half a cup of warm water, somewhere in the 109 to 117 degree range. I use my meat thermometer to measure that. And then I add 2 packages of yeast, or 5 teaspoons of bulk yeast, and 2 tablespoons of sugar, and mix that together. Then what I do is I let it sit for probably about 10 minutes. And this, what I do is I turn the oven on as low as it'll go and get it close to the oven, but that doesn't mean you have to do that. Sometimes if the kitchen is warm enough, you don't need to worry about that. You can just have it sitting out on the counter and it'll go. It may take a little bit longer for it to bubble up, but if you're not used to using yeast, it's really not that scary. Can you see down in there? So I just let it sit over here. Again, probably about 10 minutes. Then the next thing I do is I take the bowl that I'm going to actually do the mixing of the cinnamon rolls in, and I mix up the magic ingredient. Pudding. Jello pudding. 1 package mixed just like you mix it, like it says to on the package. 2 cups of milk. Sets up very fast. You do not have to put this in the refrigerator to set up. It sets up all on its own with all that gelatin in there. 2 cups of the fattiest milk that you have. I've even used whipping cream before. It does make a different consistency, and you will have to adjust your flour, probably up a little bit. But just to keep it simple, whole milk is great. Just mix that up. And let it sit. Now, we should probably talk about this baby. If I didn't have one of these, I probably wouldn't make cinnamon rolls as often as I do. And this is the industrial strength version, the professional 5+. So it's got a bigger bowl, bigger engine that it can handle the 8 cups of flour, 6 to 8 cups of flour that are in this recipe. It's got the big plug. So if you don't have the big plug, you probably don't have the engine that this one does. You can do it with a regular KitchenAid or one of the smaller KitchenAids. I would suggest halving the recipe, which means, you have some weird halving to do. You would just use half of the package of pudding and a cup of milk. The rest of it, I think, is pretty straightforward. And of course, roll it out smaller. You can also do it by hand. I've done it all different ways, keeping the recipe at the same with the same proportions. So this is super handy to have, or you can use your guns because you can do it all by hand, which I did just recently. So there's no magic time frame for the pudding. This has been sitting for about 5 minutes now, and it's already doing its thing. So that's firm enough if everything else was ready. So I put my 2 cracked eggs, 1 teaspoon of salt in with the pudding that had started to solidify. Getting it all mixed up in there, making sure it's not too cold for the yeast. I usually don't let my yeast go quite this far, but we should be okay. Because if your yeast spends all of its effort out here before it's in its recipe, then it loses its oomph and the rolls don't turn out the way you want them to. They don't raise as well, but this should be fine. I've been this high before and they've turned out okay. So right into the vanilla pudding, egg, butter, salt mixture. You want to make sure you get every little bit out of there, because every bit of that is a little bit of yeast that you want in your rolls. Give that a mix. If you are using a mixer, I use the first few cups of flour. I mix it in by hand, just because it's better that it doesn't fly all over the place. You always have to count out loud. There's 2. There's 3. So flour in this recipe is weird. There have been times that I have used 6 cups of flour. There have been times that I have used the full 8 cups of flour that you'll see on the recipe. It's humidity, it's warmth of the room, it's maybe I didn't scrape all the butter out of the Pyrex. I don't know what it is, but every time it's just a little bit different. So I go by feel. And I'll show you what I mean. It's how it clings to the bowl, whether you're mixing it by hand or by mixer. So now we're 4 and 5. I'll just get that started. And now, if you have a mixer, this is where your dough hook comes in. You can also, there are recipes for this, there are methods for this on the World Wide Web to use a bread maker. So we can look those up. I have never done that. So that's my dough hook. You only want to go up to 2, according to the manufacturer's suggested way of using the machine. So I'm gonna, because I've stirred that in, I'm gonna go ahead and go up to 2 right away. And we have 5 cups of flour in there so far. 6. I don't remember. See, this is what happens to me. I do have 8 cups measured here in this bowl. Here. I think we have 5. So I'm going to stop it. Add 6. I really don't know how many I've added. You can look back and check my work. So yeah, so you can see down in the bowl how it's clinging, or not in this case. It's starting to not cling to the bowl. That's just about perfect right there. It's probably 4 minutes total mixing. If you're doing it by hand, it's going to be a lot more than that. So at this point, I transfer it to a different bowl just because I need to use that bowl to make another batch. Just smear butter all over the inside of the bowl. Our oven is still on, which is perfect because I really like it to be a little warm in the kitchen. If you have a fire, you can put it near a fire, as long as it's not too close. I mean, essentially what you're looking for when you're trying to get dough to raise is you don't want a skin to form on it, on the dough. It just gets kind of rough and scaly. So you can see how it's pretty sticky. I could have added more flour to this and it wouldn't have been quite as sticky and it would have turned out fine. There's no magic to it other than you really don't want it, you want it not sticking to the bowl too much, which this is sticking a little, but the gooier this dough is, the more gooey your cinnamon rolls are going to be. So if you prefer a cinnamon roll that's a little firmer, then by all means, add a little bit more flour and get a dough that is a little less sticky. Now you yank it out of there. Pick out the little pieces that are left. Pat her down in there into a little ball. So we're going to let this sit for somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour. Sometimes it takes longer than that. I'm going to cover it, leave it alone in the warmest spot in your house. I've got it next to the oven that's turned up to 170 degrees. Be patient, and you're essentially going to want it to double. You want that to double. So it's going to be just kind of even with the top of the bowl around in there. It's even with the top of the bowl in this case. It's all fluffed up. Just punch it down, fold it in a few times. It's back down to the small size. Cover it back up. Usually the second raising takes a little less time, probably 45 minutes to an hour. So our second rise is complete. That first one took about an hour and a half, which is quite a while. This one took just about 45 minutes. So it's doubled in size again, just even with the top of this bowl. So I'm punching it down just like we did before. Beautiful. Oh, sometimes it just feels, so this is just supple and really nice. So I just spread out some flour here. And I'm really excited today because I have a brand new rolling pin that I just bought at the Olympia Farmers Market by Wood Love by Larry. Got his website on there if you're interested. And you don't need a fancy, I think this is called a French rolling pin, but we're going to use it today. So this is where you have to show it who's boss. And I may decide I want to use my old rolling pin by the end of this. So you want to, by the time you end, be at about 34 inches wide, 21 inches deep. And because we've got a supple dough, we can really feel free to use flour liberally. If your dough was not as sticky, then you want to be a little careful about using too much flour, because then you get tough cinnamon rolls. So I kind of do a wishbone shape, or not a wishbone, just a bone shape, kind of with a dip here and a dip here, because those ends don't like to stay out, and that's really important for keeping your shape. I always, as much as possible, roll from the middle. You're trying to pull that thicker part of the dough out to the edges. Always roll from the middle, and I'm really reefing on it here. You do not need to be exact with the 21 by 34. Just gives you a frame of reference. I have done this probably 150 times, so I know I make it look easy. $33 and just over 21. So I can see that it's a little wider here than here, so I'm just going to work with it for a minute. I just get done telling you it doesn't have to be perfect, and then I go trying to make it perfect. By the time I make enough batches of this, my arm should be very firm for the governor's ball in my gown, my sleeveless gown, or broken trail. My husband and videographer will be playing. Cup of butter the recipe calls for, that you're going to smear on here, but I put a little extra in there for good measure. I've even used as much as almost 2 cubes of butter. What ends up happening when you use more butter is it really, as they're raising this last time, comes out of them and gets into the bottom of the pan and turns caramely, which is fantastic. But it really, I don't think, has that much effect on the rolls themselves. I just like more butter whenever possible. So a little over a cube of butter. If I said cup earlier, I didn't mean cube. A little over a cube of butter. I put a little salt in there, because whenever you're dealing with something sweet like this, you want that little bit of salt to bring out the sweetness. You could use your hands for this part. You don't need a special brush. I like to use the brush. I make sure that when I bring it out, see how the butter has separated? I stir it to bring those parts back together. And then I just slop it on here. There's a million ways to do this. Your hands. I've even left it semi-solid before and spread it around, which works fine too, as long as it's soft enough. I just want to make sure that every bit. You see me brushing the flour away only because when there's chunks of flour in there, it makes it harder for the roll to adhere to itself. Any chance to get extra flour off of dough is good in this situation. So just as I did with the butter by adding a little bit extra, sometimes I do the same thing with the cinnamon and sugar in the middle. So I've got what should be 2 cups of brown sugar and about 4 tablespoons of cinnamon. Again, that's totally up to you, the ratio. It's whatever you like. You'll find as you go what you like. So I've got a little extra here. I think I've got something more like 2.5 cups of brown sugar and about 5 tablespoons of cinnamon. And again, this is just getting every inch except for a little lip around the bottom. Oh, you know what? I totally forgot to put my cinnamon in here. I am not fit for television. So I am going to, this is real world, right? So I smooth this out to every inch except for one little, probably 1/2 inch area on the bottom of the end that you're going to seal up. So the last part that you roll up. It just gives you a little bit of dough, butter, without the sugar on it so that you can close it up and get a better chance of it closing. Sometimes having these actually stay in their nice pinwheel shape is a challenge. Doesn't really matter to how they taste though, so that's the important part. So this is probably the part that people have the biggest challenge with. If you have something like this or even just a spatula, I just loosen it up, pulling those ends out a little because I want the roll to be as symmetrical as I can get it. And this is where you just have to show it who's boss. So I always start on one end and you're just rolling, and I'm tucking as I'm rolling, so I'm trying to get this middle section as tight as possible. Can't say it enough that you just have to, you don't want to tug it so hard that you're going to pull a hole in it, but if you do, that's not a problem. You just keep going. If you get a hole, you just keep going. And then you get to this end. And just see how I'm kind of hanging out here with this because I'm getting it started, so that we're a little uneven here. Look, it would appear, but really that's not a problem. I'm tucking and pulling, and I'm actually kind of lifting it up just a little bit off the counter, just ever so lightly, kind of pulling, lifting up. So you know how I'm taking a little bit longer on these ends. I'm just making sure that I'm getting it tight. I'm kind of directing it back this direction with the end. See a little flour on there, so I'm just gonna, this is a good batch. Sometimes when I'm in the middle of it, there's flour that comes up, and I'll just brush that off as I go just to aid in the roll attaching to itself. Got ourselves a big cinnamon boa constrictor here. See, I've got a little spot here where I had to kind of adjust the whole thing. You'll get a feel for this, and now I can see here that this feels like it's losing its grip, so I'm coming back, unfolding, refolding. So here's a good example of flour. Got some flour here. Brushing that off just so that when we get up here, some more. Just want that roll to have every chance it can to attach. It's science. Baking is science. So now you've got your very imperfect cinnamon log ready to be cut. You could, I suppose, just chop it with something like this or a knife, but I prefer dental floss. What you're going to do is you're going to slide up underneath it. So in this case, you've got a bunch of weird looking, funny shapes sometimes. This one is a particularly skinny on the ends. Not all of them are this way. And I'm just going to show who's boss. I'm just kind of turning it into a tall little roll. got my pre-buttered pans here. Just slathered them with butter. I've left my oven on so that we're ready to do the last raising of these. So I saved my big pan, and I used to do it in like 5 pans every time I did it, because you get somewhere between 20 and 30 cinnamon rolls. Just depends on how long your roll is. Not good batter otherwise. If you slice them thinner, you can get a whole lot more, and people actually probably like them that way because they're smaller, because these can be a little hard to deal with. So I'm just smashing them down in there. As I get these like first 3 or 4 off the ends, I put those in this kind of smaller pan, and I usually save these for us at home. But if I'm going to give them away, I give away the ones that are a little fuller. So I'm just putting them in there. You do not want them too close together. You know, at least a ½ inch between them. They need air to breathe and to expand. And they'll cook better throughout. The whole roll will cook versus it being a little raw in the center if you give them that little bit of space. So now I'm going to go to this end just because I want to get all the kind of funky ones off there first. So I'm getting them a little closer than what I recommended, but this is all right. So now it's back to rising again. Rising. Just again, I got most of my middle of my roll, the symmetrical ones, and what I will divvy up for people. And then these will be the ones that Mark and the boys and I eat. Again, I cover them up. Just give them a little warmth here. The oven is still on. And this takes usually about 40 minutes or so, sometimes quicker. We'll just let those babies sleep for a while. And I do come over and turn them throughout. I'll bring them, I'll, do this and switch sides and just kind of keep an eye on them. And you will see that they will start to seep. You'll see the cinnamon and the butter and the sugar kind of seeping out the bottom in the liquid. It's all fine. It's okay. I'll show you what I do with that sometimes after they're done. Whew. We're getting down there. They have been rising for, I'd say, probably about 45 minutes, maybe a little longer. So they are looking good. They're puffy. When they come apart like this, I just pinch them back together again. Sometimes that's futile. Sometimes I turn them so if they do come open, they'll bump into each other or the side of the pan. These feel really good, really doughy. So that's they may get a little bigger than that, but we're just going to put them in, and they'll raise even more when they come out, when they're in the oven. So I've got the oven up to 350, and we're just going to pop these right in here. Please don't notice how dirty my oven is. Thank you, appreciate that. And they're going to go in there for 15, 16, 17 minutes, somewhere in there. It depends on how you like them. If you like them really gooey in the middle, 15. And if you're really ambitious, please flip it in the middle. That really turns out the best. It gets the most even cooking. I just turn the pan all the way around about 7 or 8 minutes in. And then we'll frost them. So our Sin-A-Buns are in the oven, 15 minutes-ish. So now we'll make the frosting because we want to frost them the minute they come out. So I'm making a double batch only because during the holidays I like to have extra frosting around. So just cut this in half. So it is a brick of cream cheese, a cube of butter, and 3 cups of powdered sugar. If you don't like it that sweet, then 2 might do you, 2.5. So just do that by taste. So I melt my butter all the way down. That's what we have going on here. 2 cubes of melted butter for my double batch. I'm just going to stir this up a little bit, again, to mix the solids together. I just always like to have my butter mixed before I add it in. And this will help. You don't have to have the butter all the way melted down, but it just kind of helps to melt the cream cheese. And I try to work with everything at room temperature. I didn't say that at the beginning, but even, eggs, butter, I let everything except for milk, I let sit out and get room temperature before I use it. So we've got the butter and the cream cheese, and now I'm actually going to whip this. This could be a little messy with the butter being that melted, but you won't mind, will you? Stand back. A little bit more. So we're not quite 6. And then lastly, we add a couple teaspoons of vanilla. Please don't use artificial vanilla. Spend some money. Get the real vanilla. That's what we're using here. And as always, I put no matter what kind of frosting I'm making, I put a teeny tiny little pinch of salt. Ode to Kelly Corbett Barkhurst. Perfect. So now we're ready. Those babies come out, frost them right away. Almost forgot the most important ingredient. You don't want your frosting to be too thick. So just stir in a couple tablespoons of milk until it gets to the right consistency, and that's really up to you. You don't want to be able to pour it, but you also want it to, they're ready. I'm going to stick these extra ones in now. I don't cook those at the same time, so now these are going in for 15 minutes. So one thing I didn't tell you is that sometimes when you're cooking them, the middle of them rise up like a volcano. And if I open the oven to flip the pan around, and I see that, I just touch them with a fork, just the bottom side of the fork, just to kind of push them back down in. It doesn't really matter. They go back down in either way, but don't be alarmed if you see that. So I am just being generous with this frosting. In fact, I think I'm just going to flop a little on each one, let it get soft, and then I'll go around and smear it around. I try to totally cover them with frosting, especially when they're this brown, because it just softens them and keeps them soft. And then when you don't eat them all in the first sitting, that frosting kind of helps to keep them, I don't know, it just makes microwaving them a little more conducive. So I'm just being generous, flopping some on top of each one. This is another reason to make a double batch, that way you've got your flexibility. And some people like way more frosting than this. There's one person in this house that likes that, so even smothering them now, they may want more when they're actually eating it a few days later. So I'm getting down in every nook and cranny. I go around the edges of the pan, so I can see all that delicious goodness down in there that came out when they were cooking, the liquid butter, cinnamon, sugar combo. And it's going to be great because when you take those out of the pan, some of that can come up with it. I always go to a little extra effort to dig that out. I know that you're watching closely to make sure I don't miss a single spot. I know when I watch Trisha, I'm always keeping a close eye on her to make sure she doesn't make any mistakes on her cooking show. So I would expect nothing from my viewers. And there you have it. Angie's very hot, ready to eat Sin-A-Buns. Merry Christmas. I like slivered almonds on mine. Slightly toasted slivered almonds. And 5-6 hours later, you have a pan of cinnamon rolls. Thanks for joining us. Let me know if you have any questions. Just put them in the comments.